Hey guys, my name is Nomster, and today is the release of Forge mode in Halo Infinite. For those of you unaware, Forge is a map-making/developer tool where you can build and script your very own creations. In the pre-beta version of Forge, I built Andy's room from Toy Story, Zelda Ocarina of Time's Kokiri Forest, Hobbiton from Lord of the Rings, a functional arcade game, and a few other smaller scenes as well. If you haven't seen those videos, I highly recommend you check them out. If you have seen them, then you know you're in good hands, because today, I'll be making an extensive tutorial for getting started in Forge mode, and hopefully give you all the inspiration and tips necessary to build on your own, or with your friends if you're lucky enough to have those. Disclaimer, I am on keyboard and mouse. To avoid confusion, there should be a section at the top left of your Forge screen that shows the necessary controls to get started. So, if you're anything like me, you hyped yourself up for Forge by brainstorming a bunch of cool ideas in the months leading up to this moment. You load in, palms dripping with sweat, with absolutely no clue how to begin building your big idea. So, where should you begin? First, the basics. If you grasp how Forge works from the very beginning, it'll make your life a lot easier. Now, there are actually 3 different modes in Forge. Monitor mode, where the forging actually happens. Test mode, where object physics and scripts aren't active, but you can still walk around and get a feel for your build. And play mode, where the object physics and scripts are active. In monitor mode, there will be a window at the top left of your game by default. On this list is an option for Open Forge menu. Pressing that is when forging really begins. Now, the Forge menu itself has 5 individual tabs at the top right. Tool settings, aka the nerd settings. Map options, still nerd settings, but you actually get to use them a lot more. Folders, which allows you to rename and organize the objects you've placed. Object properties, which will prompt you to select an object first. And lastly, object browser. This is the tab you'll use the most and is how you find and place all objects in Forge mode. As you can see, the object browser lists off several incredibly vague categories, often sheltering even more categories. Keep in mind, just like everything else in Forge mode, hovering over an option will give you a more detailed description of what that option entails. For instance, the accents range from city props to workstations to vehicle options. Now, this is where the hovering descriptions come in handy. Vehicles, for instance, aren't actually vehicles you can drive, and it tells you that in the description. I'm dumb, of course, so I spent 30 minutes flabbergasted trying to find a warthog before I realized I was in the wrong category. Eventually, I left the accents category and found my way to gameplay. This is where you'll find drivable vehicles like the mongoose. Now, just like any object, selecting it from the category will place it in front of you, and if you're not used to 3D modeling software, you'll see these rather flamboyant arrows pointing in intersecting directions. On keyboard and mouse, selecting an individual arrow will allow you to drag that object in said direction. Controller users may need to refer to their control scheme settings for this part. Or be a man and randomly mash buttons. Now, a small tip is that selecting the gray cube at the intersection of the 3 axes will allow you to do this. Now, moving objects is great and all, but you can also rotate objects by changing the movement type. Rotation works identically to movement. So, our mongoose is placed and it's time to burn rubber, right? Wrong. You're in test mode, so vehicles just like object physics and scripts do not function. Entering play mode, on the other hand, will allow you to experience these features just like players playing in a custom game. But this isn't a place a mongoose tutorial, this is a tutorial demonstrating how to forge a map. To do that, you'll need to place actual objects. In doing so, just like the mongoose, you can manipulate the object, but there's a third unlocked feature for what's called static objects. Scaling. This allows you to scale objects in every direction or even evenly all at once. Now, I know stretching a sphere in various directions doesn't look like much, but it's exactly how I modeled most of the highly detailed toys from my Toy Story project. No, these aren't 3D models I imported from third-party software, just a handful of different Forge objects with some creative uses of scaling. An important note before continuing this tutorial, most objects can either be set to static or dynamic. The difference, of course, is labeled, but the important thing is that static objects can be rescaled, but dynamic objects cannot. So why even use dynamic objects, right? Well, only dynamic objects can have physics, and only dynamic objects can be referenced and moved around using Forge's new and improved scripting tool. But we'll get to scripting later. For instance, my Toy Story map would have been impossible without scaling static objects, whereas my Halo arcade map would have been impossible without scripting dynamic objects. Ultimately, it's up to you to determine what setting is necessary for your object, and I recommend experimenting as much as possible. The next thing we need to do is talk about the aesthetic object properties. Clearly, Slinky the dog looks like Slink not only in shape, but in color and material. He's a plastic toy at the end of the day, so giving each object comprising Slinky a plastic material and accurate color is necessary. But we can go even further by messing around with other settings, like roughness, scratches, and grime. The focal point of Slinky is, well, in my opinion, the slinky part. Unlike the rest of them, the Slinky has a metal material with a lower roughness setting, which helps achieve the reflective Slinky aesthetic. Forge really is all about getting creative and using objects in atypical ways. And as a matter of fact, that concept extends far beyond objects themselves. Let me demonstrate using FX. They technically count as objects, but the term particle is common too. Now I'm not going to go through the whole list because they're pretty self-explanatory, but here's a few 200 IQ ways to apply FX to your own maps to enhance the experience. Now, if you watched my Zelda and Halo video, you saw me explain how, despite water not being an option in Forge yet, you can simulate a pond and a waterfall with layers of FX. By rotating and recoloring FX such as energy barriers, I also created the illusion of water flowing down a glass window. Also, a pro tip that many forgers haven't noticed yet is that, like I said, FX can be recolored, most of which have various layers that you can actually recolor. The secret is, coloring a layer black actually makes it invisible, rather than black. For this project in particular, I added a detail of a cigarette, which is in and of itself a dry erase marker, and placed a spark effect above it because it is the only FX with smoke small enough to convincingly act as cigarette smoke. Problem is, being a spark, there's, well, sparks. Coloring the spark layer of the FX black makes that spark invisible, leaving us with just the occasional, perfectly sized smoke puff. So, we covered how to place and manipulate an object, as well as adjust its various properties. But what about combining objects? Forge has a prefab tool, which lets you group objects together and even export them into other worlds, and a weld tool. The weld tool requires that all objects involved are dynamic, meaning rescaled objects cannot be welded. Now, welding is great for translating a particular instance of physics to another object. Sounds complicated, but it's really easy to demonstrate and replicate, and extremely useful, especially if you don't care to learn about scripting just to achieve certain effects, such as, say, opening a door. Place 3 spheres, set 2 of the spheres to phase physics. I've colored them, but you don't have to. Set the middle sphere to normal physics. Remember, unlike the other 2 spheres, which can be static objects, normal physics requires the object to be set to dynamic. Now repeat that process by duplicating those objects, and you'll be left with something like this. Next, place a hollowed out hex object and scale it down so the spheres are contained. Now this hollowed out hex object is pretty important for containing these spheres, but I'll let you find it yourself in the object browsing list. Partly because I want to motivate you guys to explore the lists on your own, but also because I'm too lazy to double check where I found it. So step back and marvel at the fantastical creation you've just built. It's called a hinge. All we need to do now is weld a dynamic object to it that we want to move as if it's on a hinge, such as the door we mentioned previously. In this case, I've made 2 hinges to help stabilize the door, but you can experiment with what works best for you. As you can see, the door now obeys the spheres trapped inside that we've welded it to. It's obviously not exactly like a door though, and requires some special attention to behave like one, such as door stoppers. And of course, it doesn't close behind you on its own. This is where situations like scripting come in, at least for the average forger. Now, if you're scared of scripting because you don't know how to code, that's okay. Neither do I. That didn't stop me from scripting a working Halo arcade game in a handful of days though, and that sure as hell isn't stopping you from making a scripted door. Now, Halo Infinite uses something called visual scripting nodes, or node graphs. On keyboard and mouse, open the node graph setting by pressing the N key. N for node. This will automatically spawn an object called a script brain in your map if you haven't placed one yet. Additional script brains can be found in the object browser if you ever want to separate scripts or if your scripts are getting too over-encumbered. But we won't need to worry about that today. What we do need from the object browser is an invisible switch. Now open up your script brain and add a node. Similar to the object browser, there are tons of categories and it'll take some time to become familiar with them. What we're looking for is a node called onObjectInteract. Because, of course, we need to interact with the door. The illusion in this case is that we're not interacting with the door though, we're interacting with the switch intersecting the door. For this part, back out of the node graph, select the switch, and open the node graph once again. Instead of adding just any node from the browsing list, we'll have an option to add an object reference node, referencing the invisible switch. This node will connect to the onObjectInteract node like so. Next, we need to make our switch do something. This is where our common sense comes in. What do we want to do with the door? Well, a door opens by rotating. And would you look at that, there's an option called Rotate Object to Point. Similar to the switch, let's add an object reference for the middle sphere of the hinge, because it's dynamic and it's the pivot point of the door. Again, make sure you select the middle sphere of each hinge because the other spheres are static and cannot be welded. So, for a rotation reference, as opposed to an object reference, we're looking for the coordinates the hinge is rotating to. Rotate object to point. As you can see at the bottom, we want the z coordinate to rotate to 0 degrees for the door to open. Simple enough, right? Wrong again, because the rotation reference is asking for coordinates, not just a coordinate, so we can't just plug in a single number. In this case, we need to use another node called vector3. Coincidentally enough, the open state of the door has coordinates that are all 0, but that won't always be the case. So we plug in the xyz coordinates for the rotation of the hinge into the vector3 node. Then of course the output presents rotational coordinates that we can use for our rotational reference. The next two fields are whatever you want them to be for your door in particular. I'll be setting mine to this for now. So interplay mode, and voila, interacting with the invisible switch opens the door. But just like the non-scripted door, it doesn't close on its own, so let's fix that with a few simple steps. First off, we want to add a wait for n seconds node so there's a slight delay allowing the player to walk through the door before it closes behind them. Next, duplicate the rotate object to point node as well as its number and vector3 nodes. They plug in exactly the same, except for the closed state of the door has a z coordinate of 90 degrees. Now you can clear a pin at any given time and plug in new ones like so. Also add a different movement animation to make the animation less linear. And there we go, a door that opens and closes from either side, and you scripted it. Look at you. Now you can rub your door in your friends' faces and they'll think you're a coding savant. Now, as far as what you should build, you may not like it, but you shouldn't start with the biggest ideas you have. Start with concepts, one-off projects that increase and challenge the range of your skills. This will help you improve at forging more quickly and make it so any big idea you tackle in the future will be the best it can be. Speaking of concepts, I'll be making tutorials in the near future that are more hands-on, such as how to build a specific style, medieval, futuristic, etc., as well as how to script various useful mechanics like climbing and custom AI that follows you around dynamically. If you're interested in more Forge tutorials and original maps, consider subscribing. If you have a question about this tutorial or about something I didn't cover, leave a comment. I'll help you get started. Happy forging, everybody, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.